The wagon wheel shattered with a sound like a gunshot, and Wilhelmina Prescott heard her whole future crack apart with it. She stood in the blazing Colorado sun, June of 1878, her hands trembling as she looked at the splintered spoke, and the axle sunk deep into the red dirt of the Cimarron Trail. Sweat beaded along her hairline beneath the brim of her bonnet. Her mare, Penny, shifted nervously in the traces, feeling the wrongness of the tilted wagon. Wilhelmina's heart hammered against her ribs with a force she had not felt since the day she buried her father outside of Dodge City 4 months prior. And then the riders came. First it was 3 cowhands from the Alcott Ranch, broad-shouldered men with dust-caked bandanas, and the kind of eyes that swept over a woman alone on the road and found her wanting. They slowed, she could see that much. She could see the calculation happening behind those eyes. She straightened her spine. She raised her chin. She asked, with as much dignity as a woman standing beside a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere could muster, if one of them might spare a hand. The one in the lead, a heavy-set man named Corrigan, who she would later learn was known for cruelty toward anyone he considered beneath him, looked at her broken wheel, then looked at her, then looked at his companions. He made a sound deep in his chest that was almost a laugh but held nothing of joy in it. "Not our problem, ma'am," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat in that insulting way that men used when they wanted the gesture of politeness without any of the substance, and then all 3 of them rode on. She watched them go. She did not cry. She refused to cry. The second rider was a traveling drummer with a wagon full of patent medicines and a smile that he had practiced in mirrors until it looked almost genuine. He pulled up beside her, and she felt the first flicker of hope because he actually stopped. He asked what happened. She explained. He nodded sympathetically and looked at the broken wheel for a long moment, and she thought, for just one breath, that she had found someone decent. Then he told her he would be happy to take her into the next town for a fee she could not possibly pay, and when she said she could not afford it, the practiced smile did not falter even slightly, and he drove away. The third rider did not even slow down. The fourth was a young cowboy, no more than 20, who looked embarrassed when she called out to him, embarrassed in the specific way of a person who knows they are doing something wrong and is choosing to do it anyway. He shook his head, muttered something about being late, and kicked his horse into a canter. By the time the 5th rider appeared as a dark shape wavering in the heat off the trail ahead of her, Wilhelmina had stopped expecting anything. She had begun the mental arithmetic of survival instead. How far was she from town? 6 miles, perhaps 7. Could she unhitch Penny and ride bareback carrying what supplies she absolutely needed? She had done harder things. She had crossed the Missouri River in a thunderstorm when she was 16. She had nursed her father through cholera for 3 weeks. She had sat across from a lawyer in Dodge City who informed her that her father's debts outnumbered his assets, and she had not flinched. She was doing inventory on the wagon, deciding what could be left behind, when she heard the sound that changed everything. The sound of boots hitting dirt. She turned, and there he was, the 6th rider. He had climbed down from his horse without saying a word, had tied the animal to the wagon wheel that was still intact, and was already crouching beside the broken one, running his hands along the axle with the focused attention of someone who had looked at broken things his whole life and made it his business to understand them. This was Roscoe Hunter. And Wilhelmina Prescott, who had sworn off both hope and men for the foreseeable future, felt something shift in her chest that she was not prepared for and could not immediately name. She had been 24 years old for exactly 11 days when her world fell apart the first time. That had been the morning her father, Clement Prescott, called her to his bedside and told her the truth about their finances. The whole truth, not the softened version he had been feeding her for years. The land in Colorado, the land her father had been promising her since she was a small girl running through the wheat fields of Kansas, the land where they were supposed to build the life he had always dreamed of, that land was real. He had bought it. He had paid for it with every penny he had and several pennies he had borrowed. The deed was hers, but reaching it was a different problem altogether. Clement Prescott died on a Tuesday morning in late February, 1878, with the deed to 40 acres of Colorado land clasped in his left hand, and his right hand wrapped around his daughter's. He died with an expression of peace that Wilhelmina found both comforting and infuriating, because she could not yet see the path forward that he seemed so certain existed. She spent 2 weeks settling what could be settled and walking away from what could not. She sold the boarding house furniture. She kept her mother's silver-handled brush and her father's compass and his Winchester rifle. She bought a used wagon from a man named Holt who had 3 more than he needed and was willing to haggle. She outfitted it carefully, methodically, the way her father had taught her to do everything. Enough food for 3 weeks, tools for planting, seeds, a small iron stove. The deed in a tin box wedged under the floorboards. She left Dodge City on a morning in April when the prairie was just beginning to green, and she felt, despite everything, a rising sensation in her chest that was close to freedom. She made it all the way to within 40 miles of her land before the wheel broke. "Rear axle is bent," the man said, still crouching, still not looking at her. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a person who did not speak unless he had something worth saying. "Wheel is a lost cause, but the axle, I can work with that." Wilhelmina stared at the back of his hat. It was a battered thing, dark brown, the kind of hat that had seen years of weather and had been reshaped by rain and sweat into something entirely its own. She noticed his hands. They were large and capable-looking, with a long scar running from the base of his left thumb to his wrist that spoke of some prior violence or misfortune she did not yet know about. "You have spare parts?" she asked, because it was the practical question, the question her father would have asked first. He stood and turned to look at her for the first time, and she got her first full look at Roscoe Hunter. He was somewhere around 30 years old, she thought, with a lean, angular face that had been weathered by the outdoors into something striking rather than handsome in any conventional way. His eyes were the deep amber brown of good whiskey held up to the light, and they were looking at her with an expression she did not entirely know how to categorize. Not pity, not the calculating assessment she had seen in the eyes of the Alcott riders. Something more careful than that, something more honest. "I have a spare wheel in my pack," he said. "Standard issue. It might not be a perfect fit, but it will hold long enough to get you to Ridge Creek." She blinked. "You carry a spare wagon wheel?" "I do, on a saddle horse." The corners of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "Horse is stronger than she looks." Wilhelmina looked at the horse in question, a broad-chested roan mare that was indeed built more substantially than one might expect for a riding animal. She looked back at Roscoe Hunter. "Why?" she asked, and she did not elaborate because she thought the question was self-evident. He seemed to understand it perfectly. "Because broken wheels are common on this trail," he said, "and people get left behind when they shouldn't." It was such a simple answer, and it hit her so squarely in the center of the chest that she had to look away from him for a moment, out across the flat expanse of the Colorado plain, where the grass was bending in a wind that carried the smell of rain somewhere distant. "My name is Wilhelmina Prescott," she said, when she could trust her voice again. "I am traveling to the Prescott land claim, 40 acres northwest of Ridge Creek. My father left it to me." "Roscoe Hunter," he said, and he offered his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely respectful. "I know the country northwest of Ridge Creek. It is good land." She felt the warmth of that observation in a way she had not expected. Good land. As if he had told her the thing she needed most to hear. He worked on the wheel for the better part of an hour, and she worked beside him, because she was not a woman who stood aside while someone else did the labor that affected her life. He did not tell her to step back. He did not look surprised when she handed him the correct tool without being asked, or when she wedged herself under the wagon frame to brace the axle while he hammered the new wheel into position. He simply adjusted to her presence the way water adjusts around a stone, naturally, without ceremony. She learned things about him in that hour without either of them speaking much. She learned that he was patient, because the axle required 3 attempts to straighten before it would seat correctly, and he made each attempt with the same steadiness he had brought to the first. She learned that he was careful, because he checked every joint and fastening twice before he declared the repair sound. She learned that he was not the kind of man who needed to fill silence with words, and she found this deeply refreshing, because every other man she had known in her 24 years had seemed to regard silence as a problem to be solved. When the wheel was done, he checked the traces on Penny and declared them sound, and then he stood back and looked at the wagon the way a craftsman looks at finished work. "That will hold," he said. "Ridge Creek is 6 miles due north. The road is straight. You should be there before dark." She realized with a start that he was preparing to leave. He was already moving toward the roan mare, untying her from the wheel, and she felt a surge of something she did not fully understand, a reluctance to watch him go that was sharper than simple gratitude warranted. "Mr. Hunter," she said. He paused. "Thank you." She meant it deeply, more deeply than 2 words could carry, and she thought perhaps he understood that, because he turned back and looked at her with those amber eyes for a long moment before he responded. "Take the North Fork when the road splits," he said. "The South Fork is longer and there is a wash that floods after rain. It looks clear today, but the sky is wrong in the west." She looked west. The sky was indeed wrong in the west, a bruised purple along the horizon that she had noted but had been too preoccupied with wheel mathematics to fully consider. "I will," she said. "Where are you heading?" He was quiet for a moment. "Northwest of Ridge Creek," he said at last. She stared at him. "That is where I am heading." "I know," he said simply, and climbed back into the saddle. They traveled to Ridge Creek in a loose parallel, his horse keeping easy pace with her wagon, and she was too proud to ask him directly if he was escorting her and too curious to put the full distance between them that pride would normally have dictated. The storm he had predicted came in from the west before they reached town. Not the drowning downpour she had feared, but a brisk, cold rain that rattled against the wagon canvas and turned the road to rust-colored mud. She could see his outline through the rain, steady and unhurried, and she found herself watching him the way you watch a lighthouse when you are not sure of the water beneath you. Ridge Creek was a town of perhaps 200 souls strung along a wide main street with a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a land office, a hotel that called itself the Grand Western and was grand in neither sense of the word, a small church, and a blacksmith shop that smelled of hot iron and coal smoke even in the rain. It was a working town. She could see that immediately, a town that had not yet decided if it was going to survive or not, and she respected that uncertainty, having felt it herself on a personal level for the past 4 months. They pulled up in front of the livery stable, and Roscoe was down from his horse, and at her side before she had finished climbing from the wagon seat, not grabbing her arm the way some men did, as if a woman descending from a wagon were a catastrophe requiring intervention, but simply being present, available if she needed steadiness on the muddy ground. She did not need it, but she appreciated the offer. The liveryman was a compact, red-faced man named Garfield, who told them the hotel had 2 rooms and that supper was included if they could stomach beef stew that was, by his own assessment, aggressively mediocre. Wilhelmina paid for 1 room with coin. She counted carefully from the small purse in her inner pocket. Roscoe Hunter, she noticed, paid for his own. Over the mediocre beef stew in the hotel's small dining room, with rain hammering the window glass and a kerosene lamp throwing warm, unsteady light across the table between them, Wilhelmina and Roscoe Hunter told each other cautiously selected pieces of their histories, the way people do when they are beginning to trust someone but have not yet decided how much is safe. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, the son of a cattle rancher who had lost everything in a fire when Roscoe was 14, and that he had spent the next 16 years doing the kind of work the frontier offered men without means. Cattle drives, fence repair, a season of freighting, a winter trapping in Montana that he described as the coldest experience a living person could have without technically dying. He was 31 years old. He was heading to Ridge Creek because he had a job waiting at a place called the Broken Bow Ranch, outside of town to the northwest, where a man named Elias Canton had hired him to help manage the operation through the summer drive season. She told him about her father, about the land claim, about the plan she had assembled piece by careful piece over the 2 weeks following Clement Prescott's death. She would reach the claim. She would spend the summer building a livable structure and planting what she could, using the seeds she had brought. She would file any outstanding paperwork at the land office in Ridge Creek. She would survive. He listened to all of this without interrupting, and when she was done, he said, "You have it planned carefully." "I have to," she said. "There is no one else to do it." "No," he agreed, "there is not." They sat in silence for a moment, and the rain played against the window, and she became aware of something that had been building since the moment he had climbed down from his horse on the Cimarron Trail, a warmth in his presence that was not the warmth of the lamp, a rightness in the shape of the evening that she had not felt since before her father fell ill. She told herself it was the relief of having made it to Ridge Creek. She told herself it was gratitude, which was a powerful and sometimes misleading emotion. She told herself a great many things on her way to bed that night, none of which entirely convinced her. In the morning, the rain had cleared, and the world outside the hotel window looked washed and precise in the early light. Wilhelmina was up before sunrise, the habit of her life, and she found Roscoe Hunter in the hotel's small kitchen before the cook arrived, making coffee with the efficiency of a man who had prepared his own breakfast in places considerably more challenging than a hotel kitchen. He handed her a cup without asking if she wanted one. She accepted it without thanking him for the presumption, because somehow that felt right. "The land office opens at 8, he said. "I know," she said. "The northwest road out of town goes past the Broken Bow Ranch turnoff," he said. "If you want, I can show you the boundary markers for the Prescott claim. I know that country." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. He was looking out the window at the freshening morning, and there was nothing in his expression that she could read as anything other than straightforward helpfulness. No hidden motive she could detect. No agenda she could identify. Just a man who knew the country she was heading into and was offering to help her navigate it. She had been trained by a lifetime of experience to be careful with offers of help, because help frequently came with costs that were not disclosed up front. But she was also, at her core, a practical woman, and refusing useful assistance on principle when you were alone with a broken wagon in unfamiliar territory was not practical. It was pride dressed up as wisdom. "I would appreciate that," she said, and she watched something quiet and satisfied settle into his expression, something that was not quite a smile but held all the warmth of one. The land office was run by a man named Pender, who had the quality of a person who had handled too many documents for too many years and had begun to resemble them. He was dry and precise, and he looked at Wilhelmina's deed with the focused attention of a man reading scripture. And when he was done, he folded his hands on the desk and told her that the Prescott claim was valid, fully registered, with no competing interests on file, and that as the sole heir she had every legal right to occupy and develop the property. She felt a wave of relief so powerful that she had to press her heel against the floor to keep herself from showing it on her face. Outside the land office, in the clean morning air with the town of Ridge Creek coming to life around them, she turned to Roscoe, who had waited outside, and said, "It is legitimate, all of it." "Did you doubt it?" he asked. "My father was a good man," she said carefully, "but he was a dreamer, and dreamers sometimes convince themselves that intentions and paperwork are the same thing." He nodded slowly, as if he had known people like that, as if he understood the particular heartbreak of loving someone whose relationship with reality was optimistic beyond what the evidence supported. "The land is real," he said. "I have ridden past it. It has a good stream and the soil is worth working." "You have ridden past it," she repeated. "More than once." He paused. "There is a stand of cottonwoods along the stream that is worth seeing." She looked at him, this man who carried a spare wagon wheel on his saddle horse and had ridden past her father's land claim and noticed the cottonwoods along the stream, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, the precarious and terrifying sensation of becoming interested in someone. She packed it carefully away. There was too much work ahead of her. The Prescott claim was 7 miles northwest of Ridge Creek, and Roscoe Hunter had been right about every detail. The stream was real, clear and reliable, fed by snowmelt from the mountains to the west. The cottonwoods were real, a dozen of them in a loose semicircle along the eastern bank, their new leaves shaking in the morning breeze like 1,000 small hands raised in greeting. The soil, when she pushed her boot into it, was dark and yielding, the kind of soil that her father had described to her so many times that she would have recognized it anywhere. She stood in the middle of it and felt the full weight of her father's dream settle around her, not crushing her but holding her the way land holds the things planted in it, grounded and purposeful. Roscoe had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away, giving her the moment, and she was grateful for that in a way she could not have easily articulated. "I need to build a shelter before anything else," she said when she turned back to him. "Something sufficient for the summer, at minimum." He looked at the cottonwoods. He looked at the slope of the land. He looked at the way the stream ran. He was reading the landscape the way some men read a book, with a kind of focused engagement that told her he was taking the information seriously. "There is a natural windbreak on the north side of that cottonwood stand," he said. "Build there. You will use less wood and it will hold heat better in the autumn." "You know a great deal about building on this kind of terrain," she said. "I have built shelters in worse places," he said. "The Broken Bow Ranch," she said. "You start there tomorrow." "I do," she nodded. She was already calculating the shelter, the planting, the sequence of tasks that would need to happen in the correct order. She was a woman who moved forward. She had always been a woman who moved forward. She did not look back if looking back would only slow her down. But she watched Roscoe Hunter ride away that afternoon toward the Broken Bow Ranch turnoff down the main road, and she watched for longer than was strictly necessary. And when he reached the fork in the road, he turned his head and looked back at her across the quarter-mile between them, and she felt that look all the way through her. She planted her first row of seeds 3 days later. She built the shelter with her own hands and with the help of Garfield from the livery stable, who proved to be unexpectedly good with an adze, and a Ute man named Soaring Bear who worked occasionally in Ridge Creek, and who agreed to help with the heavier timber work in exchange for a portion of her first vegetable harvest. She framed the walls from cottonwood timber and chinked them with a mixture of clay and grass that Soaring Bear showed her was far more durable than the mud plaster she had originally intended to use. She built the roof from pine boards bought at considerable expense from a mill in Ridge Creek, because the roof was not a place to economize. By the end of June, she had a one-room cabin that was small but sound, with a proper stone chimney and a door that did not swing open on its own in the wind, which she counted as a personal victory. Roscoe Hunter rode out from the Broken Bow Ranch every Sunday. She told herself the first time that it was courtesy, because he had brought a tin of coffee from the general store and a small bundle of letters that had been held for her at Ridge Creek's modest post office. She told herself the second time that it was neighborliness, because the Broken Bow was only 4 miles east of her claim, and the man had been born with a helpful disposition. She told herself the third time that it was habit, and habits required no particular analysis. By the fourth Sunday, she had stopped explaining it and started making an extra portion of whatever she was cooking. He always stayed for a meal and left before dark. He always brought something from town, sometimes useful and practical, like nails or lamp oil, and sometimes surprising, like the time he arrived with a worn but intact copy of a Dickens novel that he had found in the bottom of someone's abandoned effects at the livery stable. She had looked at the book and then at him, and he had said simply, "It seemed like something you would want." And the accuracy of that observation had landed somewhere private and important inside her. She read the whole novel in 4 days, working through it in the evenings by lamplight after the day's work was done, and she saved the last chapter for the next Sunday, because she wanted to tell him about it while the ending was still fresh. He listened to her talk about the book with the full attention of a person who is genuinely interested, and she realized as she was talking that this was one of the things about Roscoe Hunter that most disarmed her. He was a man who actually listened. Not the performative listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the real kind where you could see the information landing, where you could watch him actually thinking about what you had said. "My mother loved Dickens," he said when she had finished. She had not known he had mentioned his mother before. "What happened to her?" "She died when I was 22, he said. "Fever. She was a remarkable woman. She was the one who taught me that a person's worth is not their circumstances." Wilhelmina looked at him across the small table in her cabin, with the Colorado summer pressing warmly against the walls and the sound of the stream through the open window and the Dickens novel between them, and she thought, "This man is someone worth knowing. Not someone to pass, the way the riders on the trail had passed. Someone to stop for." She said none of this aloud because she was not yet ready to say it, and he did not push her, because she was already beginning to understand that Roscoe Hunter did not push. July brought heat and complications in equal measure. The heat she could manage. She had brought the right tools, and she knew how to ration water and how to work in the early morning and the late afternoon, and rest through the scorching middle hours. The garden was coming in, tentative but real green rows pushing up through the dark soil with the stubborn persistence of things that have decided to survive. The complications arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a man named Harlan Driscoll. Driscoll rode onto her claim without announcing himself, which told her something immediately. He was a man of perhaps 55, thick through the shoulders and neck, with a face that had been handsome once and had hardened into something less agreeable over the decades. He was accompanied by 2 riders who did not introduce themselves and did not dismount. Driscoll told her, with the smooth calm of a person who was accustomed to delivering bad news from a position of safety, that the land she was farming was adjacent to the Driscoll cattle corridor, a route his herds had been using for 12 years to access the water on the northern range. He told her that the stream on her property was, in his opinion, critical to that operation. He told her that it would be in everyone's interest if she were to consider selling her claim at a fair price, which he then named, and which was a fraction of what the land was worth. Wilhelmina listened to all of this without moving. She was aware of the 2 riders, aware of the implication in their presence, aware that she was a woman alone on a claim 7 miles from town. She was also aware of the deed in the tin box under the floorboards, the deed that Pender at the land office had verified, the deed that Clement Prescott had paid for with every resource he had. "The land is legally mine," she said, "and the stream runs through it as a natural watercourse. I am aware of my rights regarding riparian access, Mr. Driscoll, and I am also aware that the terms you are offering bear no relationship to market value." Something moved behind Driscoll's eyes. Surprised, she thought. He had not expected this. "Ma'am," he said, with the elaborate patience of a man controlling his temper, "I am trying to be reasonable. You are trying to buy something below value from a woman you assume will be frightened into compliance," she said. "I am not frightened, and I am not selling. If you have concerns about water access, you are welcome to submit them formally to the land office in Ridge Creek." Driscoll looked at her for a long moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat with exactly the same insulting precision as Corrigan on the Cimarron Trail, and he rode away. Wilhelmina waited until she could no longer hear the hoofbeats before she allowed her hands to shake. She told Roscoe about Driscoll the following Sunday, and she watched his expression in the careful way she had developed over the past weeks, reading the fine language of his face. She saw the stillness come over him, the particular stillness that she had learned meant he was taking something seriously. "Driscoll," he said. "You know him." "By reputation," Roscoe said. "At the Broken Bow, we share a fence line with his western pasture. Elias Canton has had friction with him over boundary markers for 2 years." He paused. "He has a habit of taking what he wants and making it look like negotiation." "He will come back," she said. It was not a question. "He will come back," Roscoe agreed. She looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, something about the shape of this problem and the fact that she was, in the end, alone here, and that the world they were living in had not yet fully reconciled itself to the idea of a woman managing her own land without a husband or a father to stand between her and the Harlan Driscolls of the territory. She did not say it in those terms, because she did not need to, because she could see from Roscoe's face that he already understood it. "I am not going to sell," she said instead. "I know that," he said. "I want to make sure you know that," she said, "because I would not want anyone making calculations on my behalf that assume a different outcome." He met her eyes. "The only calculation I am making," he said quietly, "is how often I can reasonably ride out here on a Sunday without it being obvious." The air between them shifted the way air shifts before weather. She said, "Is it obvious?" He said, "I expect it is, to anyone who is paying attention." She said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the table between them, at the coffee cups and the remnants of the meal she had cooked, at the ordinary domestic reality of this Sunday afternoon in her small cabin with the stream running outside and the garden growing and the whole future of this land pressing against the walls of the present. "Roscoe," she said. "Wilhelmina," he said at the same moment, and they both stopped. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from relief. The laugh that happens when the thing you have been carefully not saying turns out to be the same thing the other person has been carefully not saying, and the symmetry of it is almost funny. He was smiling now properly, the full version, and it transformed his face in a way that she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. "I do not have much to offer," he said. "I have a job at the Broken Bow through the summer drive and some savings, and I know this country. That is the sum of it." "I do not have much to offer either," she said. "I have 40 acres of good soil and a sound roof and a considerable list of tasks that are not going to complete themselves." "I am good at tasks," he said. "I have noticed," she said. They looked at each other across the table in the warm July afternoon, and she felt the thing she had been carrying since the Cimarron Trail finally settle into its true name. Not just gratitude, not just the warmth of good company on a hard road. This was the real thing, the thing that her father had described as the only kind of wealth that did not depreciate, the thing he had shared with her mother before her mother died, the thing Clement Prescott had spent the rest of his life being quietly sad about the absence of. She was in love with Roscoe Hunter. The acknowledgement of it did not frighten her, which surprised her. She had expected to be frightened by it. She had been frightened by most of the significant things that had happened to her in the past 6 months, but this felt like the opposite of fear. This felt like arriving somewhere. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should be honest with each other about the fact that something is happening here." "I think that is an accurate description of the situation," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held her hand with the same gentleness and certainty with which he did everything. "I do not move quickly," she said. "I am not a woman who makes decisions without looking at them carefully from every angle." "I know," he said. "But I also do not pretend that things are not what they clearly are," she said. "No," he said, "you are not a person who does that." "I want to know you better," she said. "I want to know about the scar on your hand and about your mother and about the winter in Montana and about the things you are afraid of and the things you want for the future. I want to know all of it." "I want all of that too," he said. "About you." She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said. "Then come back next Sunday." "I will come back every Sunday," he said, with a certainty that was not a promise so much as a statement of geological fact, and she believed him completely. Harlan Driscoll came back, as she had known he would 12 days later. This time he came without the two silent riders, which she found more unsettling rather than less, because it suggested a different kind of message. He arrived at midday when she was working in the garden, and he dismounted this time, which she also noted. He held his hat in his hands. He had, she suspected, coached himself into a performance of reasonableness. He made a new offer. It was higher than the first but still below market value, and it included a clause about relocating her to a town of her choosing, as if she were an inconvenience to be transported rather than a person with a legal claim to specific land. She told him politely and precisely that her answer remained no. He told her, with the smile dropping just enough to show what was underneath it, that the winter in Colorado was difficult for a woman alone, that the country between her claim and Ridge Creek was not always safe, that it was a hard life even for people with resources and connections, and that she should think carefully about whether she had either. She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that a threat, Mr. Driscoll?" "It is an observation," he said. "I will note it as such at the land office," she said, "when I stop in tomorrow morning to update my records." The smile disappeared entirely. He put his hat back on. He left. She went to the land office the next morning, and she told Pender exactly what had happened, both visits, every word. Pender wrote it down carefully in the official register, and he told her that Driscoll had been the subject of 3 previous complaints from neighboring claimants, and that the Territorial Land Commission had a file on his methods. This information did not make her feel entirely safe, but it made her feel less alone, which was almost the same thing. She also stopped at the Broken Bow Ranch on her way back, because she knew that Roscoe would want to know, and because she found, increasingly, that there was no major decision or event in her life that felt complete until she had told him about it. He was mending fence on the south pasture when she rode up, and he saw something in her face before she said a word, because he was that kind of man, and he asked Elias Canton's foreman, a laconic Texan named Webb, to take over the fence work, and he and Wilhelmina walked away from the road along the pasture edge, and she told him everything. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched the stillness in him become something else, something warmer and more personal than the calm he usually presented to the world. "I do not want you to be alone out there at night," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I have been alone out there every night since June." "I know," he said. "I did not like it then either." He paused. "I mean specifically in the current situation." She looked at him carefully. She could see that he was navigating something, choosing his words with the care he gave to everything. "What are you proposing?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I have been thinking about this for a while," he said, "and I understand that you are a person who makes decisions carefully, and I am not trying to rush anything that should not be rushed." He stopped, restarted. "I am asking if you would consider marrying me, not for protection and not for convenience, for the right reasons. Because I have spent the past 2 months riding out every Sunday and counting the days until the next one, and because I believe we are, the two of us, better at this life when we are in the same place." She was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the July afternoon burned hot and gold against the pasture grass, and a meadowlark called from somewhere in the fence line, and she could smell the cattle and the hay and the warm earth of this country that was becoming hers in every meaningful sense. "I need to think about it," she said, "not because I don't know the answer, but because the answer matters too much to say without being completely sure." "Take all the time you need," he said, and he meant it. She thought about it for 4 days. She was thorough. She looked at it from every angle, the way she had promised herself she would. She thought about practical realities, and about the kind of life she was building, and about what she needed, and what she wanted, and about the difference between the two. She thought about Roscoe Hunter's hands on the broken axle, and Roscoe Hunter handing her a cup of coffee in the dark hotel kitchen, and Roscoe Hunter's face when he listened to her talk about Dickens, and Roscoe Hunter saying, "I will come back every Sunday," with that particular quality of certainty. She rode to the Broken Bow Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late July, and she found him in the stable yard, and she said, "The answer is yes." He looked at her for a long moment, the way he had looked at her on the Cimarron Trail when she had shaken his hand and told him her name, and she saw the same thing in his face that she had seen then but could now properly identify. He said, "Come here." She walked to him across the stable yard, and he took her hands and held them, and the meadowlark sang again from somewhere, and the afternoon was hot and golden around them. "When?" she asked. "As soon as you want," he said. "The Broken Bow's drive is done by the end of August. After that I am free." "September," she said. "The harvest will be in by September. I want to see what the land produces before I make any permanent decisions about the kitchen garden layout." He laughed, the full version again. "September," he agreed. The Reverend Thorncraft in Ridge Creek performed their wedding on the 14th of September, 1878, in the small white church on the main street, with Garfield the liveryman and his wife as witnesses, and Soaring Bear standing in the doorway because, the conventions of the time and place being what they were, he could not come inside. But he had brought them a wedding gift of 3 carved wooden bowls that were the most beautiful things in their cabin for years afterward. And he smiled when Wilhelmina walked out of the church as Wilhelmina Hunter, and she smiled back at him with the full force of her gratitude. Roscoe was wearing a clean dark coat she had not seen before, and his good hat, which was only marginally less battered than his working hat but had been clearly brushed. And he looked at her when she came down the aisle in her best dress, the deep blue one she had brought from Dodge City because her father had told her once that it was the color of a summer sky at evening. And the expression on his face was one she kept with her like a coin she could take out and hold whenever she needed something real to hold. He said the vows in a steady voice, without stumbling, and she said them back the same way. And when Reverend Thorncraft told him he could kiss his bride, Roscoe Hunter kissed her with a gentleness and a warmth that felt like a beginning and like a homecoming at the same time. And the small congregation, all 12 of them, applauded in the way that people applaud things they can feel are true. Harlan Driscoll sent a messenger to their cabin 3 weeks after the wedding. The messenger was a young man who was clearly uncomfortable with his errand, and the message he carried was another offer to buy the claim, this one addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Hunter rather than to Wilhelmina alone, which Wilhelmina noted with a specific and focused fury that she did not direct at the young messenger, because it was not his fault that the world assumed a woman's land became negotiable the moment a man's name was attached to it. Roscoe read the message and handed it back to her without comment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to go to Ridge Creek tomorrow morning and document this attempt as well," she said. "And then I want to write a formal letter through the land office to the Territorial Commission and CC it to the county sheriff, using the recorded pattern of harassment as the basis for a formal complaint." He nodded slowly. "That is a thorough approach." "Yes," she said. "And then I want to write to a lawyer in Denver whose name Pender gave me, who apparently specializes in land rights disputes of exactly this nature." "Also thorough," he said. "I want Driscoll to understand," she said, her voice very controlled, "that my answer is no, and that it was never a temporary no, and that the addition of your name to this household changes nothing about the answer or my right to give it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know that I will back whatever you decide and that this land is yours." "It is ours," she corrected. "It was yours first," he said. "I want to be clear that I know that." She looked at him across the room, this man who had climbed down from his horse on the Cimarron Trail and stayed, and she felt the full weight of him, of what he was, of what they were becoming together. "I know you know that," she said. "That is one of the reasons I married you." The letter to Denver produced results in a way that surprised even her optimistic projections. The lawyer, a man named Edward Calloway, was thorough and fast, and had a professional relationship with the Territorial Land Commission that gave his correspondence a weight that individual claimants' letters rarely achieved. By November, Harlan Driscoll had received 2 formal notices from the Commission regarding his documented pattern of aggressive acquisition attempts, and his most recent land title application in the county had been put on administrative hold pending review of those complaints. He stopped sending messengers. Winter came to the Colorado Plain in earnest in December of 1878, and Wilhelmina was glad of every joint she had checked twice, and every chink she had filled carefully in the cabin walls. Roscoe had added a lean-to stable against the north wall of the cabin before the first hard freeze, large enough for Penny and for his roan mare, who was named Clara, and had opinions about her sleeping arrangements that she expressed through selective ear-pinning. They settled into the rhythms of a winter life together with the ease of 2 people who had, without exactly planning it, been practicing for this for months. They had learned each other's habits and preferences over a summer of Sunday afternoons, and those habits translated naturally to the closer quarters of a shared life. She was an early riser, so was he. She preferred silence in the morning before the day began, so did he. She had a methodical approach to planning that required things to be discussed in full before being decided. He respected this, and matched it with a capacity for listening that never seemed to exhaust itself. He told her about the scar on his hand one evening in January, with the wind building outside and the iron stove throwing good heat across the room and the coffee warming between them. It was from a rope, a lasso on a cattle drive 7 years ago, a moment of inattention that had cost him 2 weeks of full use of the hand, and a reminder that the country they lived in was genuinely dangerous and required genuine attention. He told it without drama, as a simple fact, and she appreciated the plainness of it. She told him about the night her mother died, when she was 9 years old, and how her father had carried her out to the porch in the cold March air, and pointed out the constellations one by one, naming each one, because he could not fix what had happened inside the house, and he needed something he could do for her that was both real and infinite. She had not told that story to anyone before, and she watched Roscoe's face while she told it, and she saw the specific gentleness with which he received it. "That sounds like him," he said. "You never met him," she said. "No," he said. "But I know him from how you carry yourself." She reached across and put her hand against the side of his face, and he leaned into it slightly, the way animals lean into a touch they trust, and she thought she had never loved anyone more completely than she loved this man. Spring came in March, tentative, and then with gathering confidence, and the cabin felt different when the walls stopped being a defense against the cold and became simply walls, the container of a life rather than its protection. She replanned the kitchen garden with the knowledge she had earned from the first season, expanding the root vegetable section and adding a bed for medicinal herbs that Soaring Bear's wife, a woman named Bright Water, had suggested during one of their visits. Roscoe began building. He had asked her in February what she wanted the claim to become, and she had told him in specific detail, because she always spoke in specific detail when she knew what she wanted, and she wanted this a great deal. A proper house, not just the one room, a barn that could hold real livestock, because they were going to need cattle eventually if the operation was going to be sustainable. A root cellar. A proper well so they were not depending entirely on the stream for water. He listened to all of it, and then he added 3 things she had not thought of. A covered porch on the east side where they could sit in the mornings, because the morning light in Colorado came across the plain like something being handed to you, and a small workshop attached to the barn where machinery could be maintained properly, and a large kitchen garden expansion that he said was not practical so much as necessary, because the garden was clearly the thing she loved most. He was right about all 3. The news that she was pregnant reached her as a confirmation in early May of 1879, though she had suspected it since March. She told Roscoe on a warm evening when the new porch was finished and they were sitting in the chairs he had made, watching the spring sky deepen over the plains, and he went very still in the way she had learned meant something large was happening inside him. He turned to look at her, His expression had the quality of something being remade from the inside. "In November," she said. "November or early December." He took her hand. He held it for a long time without speaking, and she was glad, because anything he said would have been less than this silence, which was full of everything. "I want to name him after your father," he said finally, "if it is a son." She felt the warmth of that through every part of her. "Clement," she said. "Clement," he agreed. Elias Canton at the Broken Bow Ranch offered Roscoe a foreman position in June of 1879, which would have required him to live on the ranch property. Roscoe declined it, politely and without apparent difficulty, because the claim was where his life was, and he had never been confused about that. He continued doing seasonal work for the Broken Bow and for 2 other ranches in the area, the kind of reliable contract work that a man with his skills and reputation could maintain without being attached to any single employer, and it paid well enough for their needs with careful management. Wilhelmina's first harvest from the expanded garden was in August, and it was, by any standard she could apply, successful. She had root vegetables to store and surplus of several varieties to sell at the Ridge Creek market, which she did on the first Saturday of every month with Roscoe, who drove the wagon while she handled the negotiating, because she was better at it. They had been selling at the Ridge Creek market for 2 months when she first encountered the rumor. It came from the wife of the Broken Bow's foreman, a woman named Agnes Webb, who told her, over a display of dried beans, that she had heard something about the Prescott claim, something about a competing deed. Agnes was the kind of woman who delivered alarming information with the breathless urgency of someone who was not sure if she was helping or feeding gossip, and Wilhelmina took it seriously while maintaining visible calm, because maintaining visible calm in Ridge Creek was a matter of strategic importance. She went directly to Pender at the land office. Pender was, for the first time in their many transactions, discomfited. He told her that a claim application had been filed on a partial overlap with the Prescott land, and that the applicant had provided documentation suggesting the original survey had an error in the northeast boundary markers. He told her that the claim application had been filed by a company called Western Meridian Land Holdings, and that he had noted, in the official register, that this company had been incorporated by a man named Harlan Driscoll. She stood very still in the land office. Driscoll had not stopped. He had simply changed tactics. He had done the thing that men in his position did when direct pressure failed. He had found a technical angle, a procedural mechanism, a way to make the legal record itself into a weapon. She sat down in the hard wooden chair across from Pender's desk, and she thought very carefully for a very long time. "What is the status of the application?" she asked. "It has been submitted to the Territorial Commission," Pender said. "You have 60 days to respond with counter-documentation." "And the survey error he is alleging, it would require a resurvey," Pender said, "which is in itself a significant process." "I see," she said. She rode back to the claim and she told Roscoe, and he sat with it for a moment, and then he said, "Calloway." "Yes," she said. "I am writing to him tonight." She wrote the letter that evening and sent it first thing in the morning, and then she sat down with the deed and the original survey documents and every piece of paper she had, and she went through all of it with the systematic attention she had given to everything on this land since the moment she arrived, and she found something. The original survey, commissioned when her father filed the claim, had been conducted by a licensed surveyor named James Hewitt. She had his name, his license number, and his address in Pueblo, Colorado, listed on the survey document. If Hewitt was still alive and available, his original survey notes would be the most powerful possible rebuttal to any claim of measurement error. She wrote a second letter that evening to James Hewitt in Pueblo. Edward Calloway responded in 11 days. He had, he wrote, already been monitoring Western Meridian land holdings as part of his ongoing work on territorial land rights cases, and Driscoll's use of a shell company to pursue the same claim he had failed to acquire through direct pressure was a pattern he had documented in 2 other cases. He would represent them before the Territorial Commission at no charge beyond expenses, because this case was, in his professional opinion, precisely the kind of clear-cut example of bad faith land acquisition that the Commission needed to confront. James Hewitt responded in 18 days. He was alive. He was 73 years old and, by his own description in the letter, still as particular about measurements as the day I learned the trade. He had his survey notes. He would be happy to appear before the Territorial Commission and verify the original boundary markers. Wilhelmina read both letters aloud to Roscoe at the kitchen table. He put his hand over hers when she finished. "Driscoll does not know who he chose to fight," he said, with a quiet satisfaction that was one of the most privately pleasing things she had ever heard him say. The Territorial Commission hearing was scheduled for October in Colorado Springs. Wilhelmina was 7 months pregnant when she made the trip to Colorado Springs in a hired coach, because Roscoe flatly refused to let her make it in the farm wagon, and she agreed with him that the farm wagon on that road in her current state was not a sensible choice. Roscoe sat beside her the whole way with the particular alertness of a man who intends to catch something if it falls, and she let him be alert, because it cost her nothing and clearly mattered to him. The hearing lasted 2 days. Edward Calloway was everything his letters had suggested: methodical, precise, and fully conversant with the exact legal principles at stake. James Hewitt was magnificent. He was a small, white-haired man with a surveyor's absolutely uncompromising relationship with accuracy, and he presented his original survey notes with the confidence of a man who had never made an imprecise measurement in his life. The Commission's own surveyor, who had been sent to re-examine the boundary in advance of the hearing, confirmed Hewitt's original measurements within an acceptable margin of error. Harlan Driscoll was present at the hearing, across the room, and she looked at him once directly, long enough to be sure he saw her looking, and then she looked away and kept her attention on what mattered. The Commission ruled in their favor on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Western Meridian Land Holdings' application was rejected. The Prescott claim boundaries were confirmed. A formal notation was entered in the Commission record regarding the bad faith nature of the application, which Calloway told her would be relevant if Driscoll or his associates attempted anything similar in the future. Outside the Commission building, in the October afternoon in Colorado Springs, she stood on the steps with Roscoe on one side and Edward Calloway on the other, and she felt the full, clean weight of the victory settle into her bones. "Is it over?" she asked Calloway. "It is over," he said. Not from any desire of mine to simplify, but genuinely. The Commission notation changes the calculus for him significantly. The cost of another attempt would be higher than the potential return. She nodded. She took a long breath of the cool Colorado air. Roscoe put his arm around her and she leaned into him, just slightly, just enough to feel the solid reality of him, and he kissed the side of her head in the gentle way he had, and she thought, "We built this, both of us, and no one is going to take it." Clement Prescott Hunter was born on the 14th of November, 1879, in the bedroom of the new house that Roscoe had mostly finished by the end of October, with just enough of the trim work still outstanding to give him something to complete while she was confined. The midwife was a woman named Elspeth Greer, who lived 2 miles south of town, and who had delivered more than 60 children in the territory, and had the calm authority of someone who had seen every variation the process could produce. He was a large, loud, red-faced baby with a decisive personality apparent from the first moments of his life, and Wilhelmina looked at him, this small specific person who had not existed before, and was now the most present reality in the room, and she understood, finally and completely, what her father had meant when he talked about the kind of wealth that did not depreciate. She looked up at Roscoe, who was sitting beside her on the edge of the bed looking at their son with an expression she did not have adequate words for, and she said, "He has your eyes." Roscoe looked up at her. His eyes were very bright. "He has your jaw," he said. "Poor child," she said. He laughed, and the laughter broke through something in him that she could see had been held carefully behind his controlled exterior through the whole long night, and she reached out and took his hand with the hand that was not holding Clement, and he gripped it and held on. "Clement Prescott Hunter," he said softly, looking at the baby again. "He will need a nickname," she said. "There will be confusion otherwise." "Clem," said Roscoe. "Clem," she agreed, and felt her father somewhere in the sound of it, felt the whole long arc of the story that had begun with a deed in a dying man's hand and ended here, in a room with good walls in a house on land that was theirs, with a baby named for the man who had started it all. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was a hard one, but they were prepared for it. And hard winters are different when you have a warm house and a full root cellar and another person to divide the labor and the worry. Clem was a good baby in the sense that he was vigorously alive and expressed himself without reservation, and the cabin was sometimes very loud, and Wilhelmina moved through the loudness with the same calm competence she brought to everything, which Roscoe found one of the most impressive things he had ever witnessed, and told her so. "I am not calm," she said, one evening when Clem had finally collapsed into sleep after an extended campaign of protest. "I simply learned early that performing panic does not reduce the underlying problem. That is exactly what calm is," he said. She considered this. "I suppose it is," she said. He looked at her across the room in the lamplight, with the baby sleeping in the cradle he had made from cottonwood and the fire burning steadily in the stone fireplace, and he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "When I was riding the Cimarron Trail that day," he said, "when I came over the rise and saw your wagon stopped, I had already ridden past 3 people who needed help, not people with broken wagons. I mean people in general, situations that were not my problem, the kind of thing you tell yourself you cannot stop for on a long road." He paused. "I had been doing that for a long time, riding past." She was very still. "I do not know why I stopped," he said. "I have thought about it a great deal. I think it had something to do with the way you were standing. You were looking at the wheel and you had your hand on your hip and you were clearly calculating something, and I thought, this person is not going to fold. This person is going to work through this problem whether or not anyone helps them, and I wanted to be the person who helped." She said, after a moment, "The other riders passed me, 5 of them." "I know," he said. "I saw Corrigan's tracks on the road." "I know Corrigan. Why do you think they did not stop?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because helping someone costs you something," he said. "Time, energy, the comfortable feeling of your own momentum. And most people, when they are in motion, do not want to stop. There is always a reason not to stop. The road is long. The day is short. It is not your wagon." "But you stopped," she said. "I stopped," he said. "And it was the truest thing I ever did." She got up from her chair and she went and sat beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the warmth of their house on their land while the Colorado winter pressed against the walls and their son breathed quietly in his cottonwood cradle. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "So am I," he said. "So am I." Spring returned as it always does, with a green that is always new regardless of how many springs you have seen. And the Prescott Hunter claim, which everyone in Ridge Creek had taken to calling by both names, became something more each season. The barn Roscoe had built that first year was expanded to hold the small cattle herd they began developing in the spring of 1880. 6 cows and a bull acquired from a retiring rancher north of town who sold at a fair price, because Roscoe had worked his roundup for 3 seasons and had earned the man's respect. The kitchen garden that Wilhelmina tended with the care and intelligence she brought to all things was now a genuinely productive enterprise, selling at the market and supplying the household and occasionally feeding visitors, who came more frequently as their reputation for hospitality spread through the area. Soaring Bear and Bright Water came for supper on the first Friday of every month, and these evenings were among Wilhelmina's favorites, because Bright Water knew things about the land and its rhythms that no book contained, and she shared them generously with a woman she had recognized early as someone worth sharing with. Clem grew into a child of loud opinions and deep loyalties, with his father's amber eyes and his mother's jaw, and a nature that was entirely his own, and he followed Roscoe through the work of the farm with the focused attention of someone taking notes on a subject of infinite interest. In the spring of 1881, Wilhelmina told Roscoe that she was pregnant again. He received this news with the same stillness as the first time, and then the same brightness breaking through, and she thought she would never tire of watching this happen. "Do you have a name?" she asked. He looked at her. "I have been thinking about my mother," he said. "Her name was Rose." "Rose Hunter," Wilhelmina said, testing it. "If it is a girl." "If it is a girl," he agreed. "And if it is a boy?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "James," he said. "After your father's father," she smiled. "James Clement Hunter," she said. "My grandfather would have been pleased." It was a girl. Rose Hunter arrived in October of 1881, 3 weeks earlier than expected, with a speed and certainty that suggested she had made up her mind and saw no reason to delay. She was small and fierce and dark-haired, and she looked at the world from the first day with an expression of evaluation that, Roscoe said, was exactly Wilhelmina's expression when she was thinking about a problem. Wilhelmina said she did not make that expression. Roscoe said she very much did. They were both right. The autumn of 1881 brought a development that none of them had anticipated. Edward Calloway wrote to tell her that Harlan Driscoll had sold his cattle operation and the majority of his land holdings and had left the territory entirely. Calloway did not know the full reason, but he suspected the accumulation of formal complaints, the commission notation, and the very public defeat of his Western Meridian landholdings application had made continued operation in the territory more costly than profitable. He was, as far as Calloway could determine, gone. Wilhelmina read the letter twice, then handed it to Roscoe, who read it once and set it down. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Relieved," she said, "and a little hollow, the way you feel when you have been braced against a weight for so long that its absence feels structural." He nodded. "It will pass," he said. It did pass, and what replaced it was a lightness she had not felt since before her father's illness, a lightness that was the specific product of safety, the feeling of the ground being solid beneath you in every direction you could test. The claim continued to grow and become what she had planned. By the winter of 1882, there was a proper barn, a root cellar, an expanded house with a bedroom for each child, and a study that Wilhelmina claimed as her own and kept carefully organized. A porch where she and Roscoe sat on every morning that the weather permitted, watching the Colorado sun come across the plain in the way he had described as something being handed to you. He had been right about that, as he had been right about the windbreak and the axle and the sky in the west, and most of the significant things. She told him once, on the porch in the early morning of a September that felt like the best September she had ever known, that she thought about the riders on the Cimarron Trail sometimes, Corrigan and the drummer and the young cowboy and the others. "Do you think about them with anger?" he asked. "No," she said after thinking about it, with a kind of sad clarity. "They were telling me something true about who they were, and the world being what it is, I might have predicted it." She paused. "But I also think that each of them had a moment when they could have made a different choice, and they did not, and I wonder sometimes if they know that." He was quiet for a moment. "I think most people know," he said. "They just find it easier to keep moving." She looked at him. The morning light was in his face, the amber brown of his eyes catching it, and he was looking out at the land the way he always did, with the proprietary affection of someone who has chosen a place and stayed. "I am glad you were different," she said. "So am I," he said, for the second time in their life together with the same certainty as the first. In the spring of 1883, they celebrated 5 years since the day on the Cimarron Trail. They did not mark it formally or make ceremony of it, because they were not people who required ceremony for the things they knew the deepest. But Wilhelmina made the particular beef stew that she had first made for him the third Sunday he rode out from the Broken Bow. The one he had told her without a word of flattery was the best thing he had eaten since his mother's cooking. And they sat at the kitchen table in the house on the land that was fully and unambiguously theirs, with Clem doing his evening sums on the table's corner and Rose asleep already in her room. And they ate together in the comfortable quiet of two people who have been honest with each other for long enough that no particular conversation is necessary. After supper, they sat on the porch. The spring evening was cooling toward a chill that still held the winter's memory, and Roscoe brought a blanket from inside without being asked, because he had learned her patterns as thoroughly as she had learned his, and they sat side by side with the blanket across their laps and the Colorado sky turning from copper to violet to the deep blue that was the color of her best dress, the one she had worn to their wedding. "What do you want?" he asked. The question was genuine, not testing, the kind of question you ask someone when you trust that the answer will be true. She thought about it. "I want the root cellar to hold enough through next winter," she said, "because last year was close. I want the north pasture fence to be finished before the cattle get there in May. I want Clem to take his reading more seriously because he has the capacity and he is being lazy about it." She paused. "I want the porch to stay exactly as it is." "What else?" he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "I want this," she said. "This specific thing, this exactly." He pressed his lips to the top of her head and held them there for a moment. "You have it," he said. Clem came out onto the porch in his stocking feet, as he frequently did, because the end of the evening was the time he liked to ask the questions that had been accumulating during the day. He was 4 years old and the questions were relentless and occasionally brilliant and always specific. "Papa," he said, settling himself between them on the bench without ceremony, "why do you keep the spare wheel in the barn?" Wilhelmina and Roscoe looked at each other over his head. "Because it is useful," Roscoe said. "But you never use it," Clem said. "I used it once," Roscoe said. "Before you were born, I used it to fix your mother's wagon." Clem considered this. "Was it broken?" "Very broken," Wilhelmina said. "And you fixed it, Papa." "I fixed it," Roscoe said. "Oh," said Clem, satisfied, settling back against his father's side with the particular boneless comfort of a small child who has got the information he needed. The stars were coming out above the Colorado plain, the same stars that Clement Prescott had named for his daughter on a cold March night long ago, and Wilhelmina found them one by one in the darkening sky, naming them silently, a private conversation with the man who had started her on this road. She thought about a deed in a dying man's hand. She thought about a broken wheel on the Cimarron Trail. She thought about every rider who had passed her without stopping, and she felt, not bitterness toward them, but a kind of settled gratitude for the specific sequence of events that had made this moment possible. If one of them had stopped, if any of them had offered a hand and she had accepted it, if the sixth rider had not been the man he was, but they had not, and he was, and here she was. Here they were. The fourth spring on the claim had brought the south pasture into full productivity, and the barn was solid and the well was deep, and the cottonwoods along the stream were older and more certain of themselves, and Rose would walk at the end of the summer and Clem was already reading better than he let on, and the root cellar was going to be full this winter. She was going to make sure of it, and the porch was exactly as it was. There were more years ahead of them. More seasons of work and weather, more mornings on the porch, more evenings with the children asking questions that required careful answers, more letters from Callaway and more market Saturdays in Ridge Creek, and more dinners with Soaring Bear and Bright Water, more first plantings and last harvests, more moments like this one that were small and enormous at the same time. More of all of it, because a man had climbed down from his horse on a dusty trail in June of 1878 and stayed. Roscoe's hand was warm around her shoulder, and the night was coming in the way the best nights come, slowly and full of stars. And the Colorado plain stretched away in every direction from the cabin on the claim, from the house they had built together on the land that was theirs. And Wilhelmina Hunter, who had once stood beside a broken wagon in the blazing sun and watched rider after rider pass her without stopping, pressed her hand against her husband's chest and felt his heartbeat. Steady and faithful and entirely present, and she was home. She had always been heading here. The broken wheel was simply the door. And the man who had climbed down and stayed was, and always had been, the answer to the question she had not yet known she was asking. The stars named themselves one by one above the Colorado plain, and the family on the porch sat in the warm dark of a spring evening, and the land was good, and the life was theirs, and it was exactly and completely enough.